A very good evening to one and all present, and welcome to a brand new episode of VUTV by Vijay Bhumi. We are discussing today a very, very important and crucial topic that touches the lives of students and school educators. In today's conversation, we are going to unravel the truth behind the following questions. First, is the learning we are imparting in schools today actually relevant for the times to come? Second, what is more key in the years to come? Is it skill-based education or knowledge-based education? Third, are our modes of assessment accurate to gauge the learning of students? And fourth, is there a need to relook the assessment patterns in schools? We're going to be discussing this and all more in our conversation today, where we're going to be talking about what should students be learning in schools and how do we measure it. Now, while we were conceptualizing this particular session, we were very clear that we definitely needed a very experienced and eminent educator to join us on today's conversation and share with us their experience of building institution, building innovative and unique assessment patterns, and also a person who's passionate about education and is constantly looking to reinvent the wheel in terms of what we teach our children. And while we were thinking of all of this, there's only one name that came to our mind, and that was Kaisar sir. The kind of varied and diverse experience that he has, right from being associated with Sherwood to being the vice principal, acting principal at the Kodaikanal International School, being the head of school principal at the Singapore International School, and currently being the head of school at the Podar ORT International School, I do not think we could have had a more experienced educator than him. He's also currently the president of the South Asian IB Schools Association. And obviously, they're gaining immensely from him because of the vast experience that he has in school education. I'm so excited and delighted to be welcoming you, sir, today on today's conversation. Thank you so much for taking out the time and joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And I would also like to welcome all our lovely audience members. Thank you very much for joining us on a week-on-week basis. It is because of the encouragement that we get from all of you that we are presenting and bringing and curating content on a weekly basis and getting you these very exciting conversations with eminent educators like Kaisar sir. So everybody knows the format of our conversations. It's going to be highly engaging. I will request all my audience members, you have already discovered the chat box feature option. Please make sure that you're sending us a lot of questions. You can also privately DM the questions to me, and I will make sure that I will integrate them in my conversation with Kaisar sir. So I hope I'm audible. I'm sorry, everybody. Yeah. Clearly a sign that the pandemic needs to end and we need to get back to our workplaces to work. So without further ado, let's begin this conversation with sir. So sir, first question, let's get to the basics. What do you think? What's actually worth learning in school? What is the kind of education we should be imparting in schools to our students?
Right. Learning should be relevant first. And learning should develop lifelong learners. Learning, other than being relevant, should be rigorous and reflective. So in other words, learning is more process-oriented and not just about teach and test and leave the rest. So for success in schools and life, students need to be more proficient, not just in the academic areas and getting good scores in the standardized tests. Those goals definitely should form the floor, but not the ceiling, all right, of the education. So to truly thrive, the students definitely need to develop attributes which aren't typically tested through the so-called standardized tests, which do not exactly capture them. Often they are referred as non-cognitive skills, meaning not knowledge-based skills. It could be what Daniel Coleman would call socio-emotional learning. It could be what Howard Gardner would call what we call multiple intelligence, which is personal skills. So in these areas, we can pull out a lot of skills, and I would just perhaps talk about 5 other things, like, for example, empathy, self-control, integrity, diversity, resilience. So when education engages students in understanding and developing these kinds of skills, they change the mindset, and they raise the expectation for student learning. So as an added benefit, they can see significant improvement in school and classroom culture. So wrapping up this question is that it just has to, we just have to move from the floor of learning to the ceiling of learning.
Totally agree with you, sir. And in fact, what you're saying is very much in sync with what the major reports are also saying these days. I mean, if you were to look at the World Economic Forum's report on the 21st century skills that professionals need to have, there's a lot of focus now on, humane-based skills. Right? We're talking about interpersonal skills. We're talking about, understanding diversity. We're talking about understanding, critical thinking skills. And that is really going to be the foundation. And I also feel that that's where even school education might be headed, because, in a time that we're talking where, we are going through this massive technological revolution, these are obviously going to be skills that are going to differentiate students in the future from machines. So totally agree with you there, sir. Now, my next question to you, sir, is the fact that, obviously, like I touched upon the fact that we have this massive technological revolution that we are sitting in, and the pandemic has definitely accelerated the pace. So is there a need to revisit what we are teaching in schools in the digital age?
Yes, for sure. You need to revisit what you're teaching in schools, but not because you are in a digital age. That perhaps could be one of the prompters, because I believe technology is an enabler of learning. So it does not substitute teachers. It definitely enables learning. So technology is an enabler of learning for sure. Remember the fact that a lot of learning will have to be personalized. So that's when learning becomes, technology could perhaps add flavor to that personalized learning. And then you want the learner to be independent. We talk about developing independent learners. So how do you develop independent learner? And that's where technology plays a role. Teacher as a facilitator, rather than, teaching upfront, directed teaching, very didactic kind of teaching. So, how do you kind of make sense of it? So yes, for sure. In India, I think the challenge in India, I'm this, of course, the international boards are in a better space. But when we come in terms of India, for sure, there is a digital divide. I think that needs to be addressed first. So, once we overcome that digital divide, then I think we run into the story. Okay, now how do you revisit the teaching? So, while the new education policy, which has been interestingly, given to us during the pandemic, all right, it obviously makes us feel very good about it. But as I have always said, that a lot would depend on how we implement it. And that's, I think, very specific to things. So yes, definitely we need to understand that technology reach is better, but then technology needs to be provided. It should not be somebody saying, you know what, as a poll promise, like, I'm going to give you free electricity, but not defining how many hours are you going to give that free electricity. So what I'm saying here is that, you have the bulb, but you probably not have the current going through it. So it's important that, we fix that from the aspect of the country, but generically, for sure. But I would say, if you're talking about the age, that is the 21st century, and if that is the reference to digital age, I think then, yes, definitely. The entire thing, whether it's a learning outcome, whether it's assessment, whether it's teaching and learning, the three pillars, as I would call it, of good learning, needs to be revisited, reviewed, and further developed.
Absolutely, sir. And I totally agree with you. I mean, now we are moving towards more of learner-centric learning, and where students need to be focused, need to be at the center and at the focus of learning. And absolutely agree with you, even on the new education policy, while it is very promising in nature, and there are some very interesting provisions that have been provided for, some interesting structural changes that have been provided for. The question really comes down to and boils down to that how well are we going to implement it, and that only I think time will tell. But I must ask you this question that, because you have worked so closely with the IB accreditation bodies, the IB examination bodies, you have seen the system so closely. You have, administered the system in so many different schools. So if I were to ask you in terms of the learning aspect and the assessment aspect, what can Indian schools that are not IB board based schools, what can they take from, the IB board in terms of learning and the assessment patterns? If you may share your experience with us on this.
I think there's a lot, even under the present system, there is, which is inhibiting, no doubt. But there's lots which schools can do till grade 8. Right? There's no board in India which is, stopping you to do what you want. Yes, in 9 and 10, if 9 and 10 is SSC, if 9 and 10 is ICSC, if 9 and 10 is CBSC, or whichever board we are talking about, local boards we are talking about. Yeah, that parameter, but what is stopping schools from, looking at its curriculum and making those kinds of enhancements? Now, having said that, you also have a lot actually in these national curriculums, areas which perhaps the schools haven't explored because of the numbers, I think sheer numbers. So I think if technology was taken seriously in these big schools, right, where you have classes of 50 or 60 or whatever the number is, I think that would be beneficial because that's how it perhaps would move, because the sheer size is the issue. How do you deliver when it's a size? So you kind of say, okay, it's a directed learning, so the child is left behind. So you are covering the curriculum. When I'm saying covering, meaning it's like covering it up.
Correct.
Not
Correct.
uncovering it. Not
correct.
That I think that's required. So I think what they can take from international boards is the idea that the focus is not so much on teaching, the focus is on learning.
Correct.
So when your focus shifts to learning, then it doesn't matter how you are dealing with, how much of technology you use, how much of people how much of manpower you use. And when everything is when most of the learning is indeed memorizing, then I think processes could do it. I mean, I don't need a teacher to tell me that where is the Taj Mahal. I'm sure software can answer that to me, right? I can
Correct.
get that.
Correct.
So I think, yes, definitely in CBSE, we have something called life skills. And in ICSE, you have something called SUPW.
SUPW, right.
And community service. When I was teaching ICSE days, I remember children calling it some useful period wasted. Now, that was not the intent.
Correct.
But that's what they felt, because it didn't carry marks. That was the whole issue.
Correct.
So
I totally agree with you here.
So you always saw it from the prism of what I say is the learning or knowledge you're looking at, cognitive knowledge you would like them to acquire, which was the floor, and never rising up to the ceiling.
Correct.
That's
absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a very good takeaway. So for all the, other educators joining me on this conversation today, I think this is a very key point and a key takeaway we can take from this conversation is that we need to shift our perspective. It should not, like Sir very rightly said, we should not make it teaching centric, but rather learning centric. I mean, just a shift in that perspective, a shift in that narrative can make a sea of change in the way, children perceive and absorb that education and the way we are also delivering that education. So, sir, in your response here, you also did touch upon, the second most important topic we're talking about today, which is assessment, and which is so critical and key in the learning cycle of a student. So I'd like to understand from you that how should assessment be formulated to improve learning? Like, what are your views on this?
Actually, that's a huge question, but a good question. So I think let me just start with that. Classroom assessment is not about giving tests. I've gone slow here so that people can get that. But more fundamentally about how to transform the way a teacher facilitates learning. Put learning in the center. A teacher is not there to do a performance, right? When you go there, the teacher has done some activities and blah, 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 and it sounds so good. It's a good class, but everybody didn't get it. Maybe the good kids got it, the average got it, or what you call average. The people who couldn't get it, or you'd call backbenchers or whatever, well, they are left to themselves. So assessment, therefore, is to facilitate learning, to transform learning, must be comprehensive, which means it should not be one test based. That's like do or die. Either you do this, you swim or sink. So comprehensive means there should be multiple forms of assessment, right? And assessment should be an integral part of teaching and learning, right? So assessment, when somebody tells me I have only so many days of teaching and learning, say out of 200 I have so many days, and so many days are taken away by exams or tests, then such a person is not seeing that as an integral part of teaching and learning. I think that's the problem. All right. Thirdly, assessment should provide worthwhile and credible information. It's not about test and getting the mark, right? And if you ask the child, like, okay, what is it when I give a paper to a child, what does he do first? Well, he first looks at what he got. All right. And then he looks around and asks the other guy, what did you get? So, and I believe that's how and that's about it. And there's no reflection on it. It's not considered as a process. So assessment should be a process, right? It's an engagement. It's a magnified conversation you're having with the child. It's a circular process. It's not a linear process. I teach and I assess over. No, it's a circular flow. All right. And it should facilitate, it should provide answers to questions. I don't mean the knowledge questions. I mean answers to the questions in learning. It should facilitate informative reporting. All right. Having said that, assessment is most effective if it is woven in the culture of the school.
Correct.
So what is the culture of the school? Have you seen movies like Three Idiots? You saw that, right? I was thinking of what was the culture of that college, wherever
Correct.
they were studying. It's
Correct.
very important. It's very important how you view assessment. And you saw in that movie what, and it posed some very interesting questions, I believe, that film.
Correct.
Right, to the common
Correct.
masses in the common language. And I think if you just take that piece up and say, so what I'm saying is that how does assessment become part of the culture of the school is that effective schools have a school-wide policy, procedures concerning the gathering of assessment data, and effective schools should ensure that the information is shared and reviewed by all staff. Data gathering across the school then can be used to direct resources and support development of appropriate teaching and learning practices, programs, policies, and support student needs. So it's actually a huge term. It's not about giving a quiz or an exam and then calling it the end. So I think that's how assessment should be formulated to improve learning. Basically, all assessment, as I just kind of to round it off, is to say that there's no one way to assess a child.
Correct.
And if we understand that and move away from that, all right, and look at learning as a continuum.
Correct.
It's not just about what the child learns in grade 6, but there's a continuum of middle school, there's a continuum of high school, there's a continuum of primary years, and how does all that link up?
Correct.
To be a data-driven school. And the data then leads and feeds back into the system. Yeah.
Correct. No, absolutely. I think that's a wonderful response and actually ties in very beautifully to what you said earlier about technology being an enabler for better learning. So in fact, like you're saying, schools being, more data driven. In fact, if you embrace technology also, this can really help you churn out a lot of the data and also actually tell you specifically what each child wants and actually then make it learner centric. And I think the example that you also gave of, this tendency of students to look at their marks first and then peer into what their neighbor has got is actually something. That's the kind of culture we have, because most of the Indian households, you see, when the child gets their paper home, even the parents are only interested in knowing, okay, how much did you score and how much did XYZ score. I mean, and that's such, that's so sad, because like you said, I mean, let's forget about, that one mark that you've got or what the other person's got. It's also a reflection of what the student has learned, and also a reflection of how well the school has been able to teach the student.
Just to add a little bit to it, if it is okay.
Please, sir.
Yeah, it's like, marks by themselves don't tell anything.
Correct.
If you were to tell me that, Mr. Kaisar, I got 95%, it doesn't tell anything about you. Why? Because I have to ask many other questions. I might start by asking 95 out of how much. And if you say 150, then I'm going to take a different take on it. If I say 100, I say, okay, then what's the other question I might want to ask? What was the highest? Now, if I say the highest was 100, the way you're looking at that child is going to change. And then if I give you some more data, that the average was 95 and the lowest was 94. Now, how do you judge that? So what I'm trying to say is, as I said, marks by themselves say nothing. Correct. You have to have other data input for you to take a judgment as to what this child is actually all about, right? You could perceive it, supposing in this hypothetical example, I might just say that perhaps it was an easy paper. I might ask, okay, what topic it was on? Is it on the full syllabus? So many other questions you have to add in order to say whether the child has performed well or not performed well. So the long and short of it is, marks by themselves say nothing.
Absolutely. And I even really liked your first opening line, which you started with, which is that assessment should be comprehensive. So we should just stop looking at it as, one particular mechanism to test, or just one particular final exam or something like that. I think educators and schools also have to be very creative in the kind of assessment patterns that you roll out to the students. Fantastic. Now I'd like to know from you that how should schools strike a balance between formative and summative assessments? I think this will be of very, great interest to my educators who are joining me in my audience today, because I'm getting a lot of private DMs about this.
All right. Now, research is changing the slant of assessment today, right, in this 21st century. So let's talk about the kinds of assessment. Assessment of learning, assessment for learning, summative and formative assessments. You have assessment as learning also, where alert teachers these kinds of assessment alerts the teachers to understand the needs of the child, to be aware of the goals of instruction, and then has the responsibility for moving their own learning forward. The child has. Or it could be assessment for teachers. So which refers to the use of assessment information by teachers to evaluate their own teaching program. So now you have 4 assessments: assessment of learning, assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment for teachers. Having said that, how do we stand today in the world with regards to the word formative and assessment? Actually, these words are no longer being used as much as they should be. Now it's on the decline. Today we talk about ongoing assessment. Remember, I started by saying
Correct.
that education is about the process of learning. It's in the continuum. So
Correct.
If that is the learning outcome you're talking about, right, that it's the process which is more important, right? So if you're supposing you are going to be a scientist, right? So the process of how inventions are happening, that is important, right? So that the child must learn in his school days, that you don't get the result just one fine day, or you don't come first in 100-meter dash just by getting up one morning like a morning lily and running around and maybe getting the first prize or something. No, it comes with rigor, it's practice and all that kinds, right? So today in our world of IB, we have changed the notion to ongoing assessments. All right. So what is ongoing assessment? Ongoing. So why do we say formative and summative? Why not call it assessment, which is ongoing? You see the development curve, and you work it. So what does ongoing assessment then require? It obviously requires that whatever you are teaching them, all right, you are obviously seeing the process and having assessments on it. So there's a performance criteria. The criteria is clear, is understood by all, and there's a feedback. All right, it's simple actually. Whatever you want. So assessment of learning, for learning, assessment as learning, all comes into the story, depending upon where you are with the child. All right. So perhaps the nuances of how you look at it changes. Now, if you were to ask me what is in the ongoing assessment, if I use the jargon of formative and summative, well, it's more dependent on formative. But the summative is not necessarily an exam. It could be a portfolio a person is presenting. It could be an electronic portfolio. Why just a portfolio of his work? And you're looking at his work and providing a success criteria. And the beauty of the ongoing assessment is that the assessment criteria, the success assessment criteria, is co-created with the child. So the child has a hand in that co-creation. How much more beautiful can learning then be? Right? So to me, the days of formative and summative are actually, the terminology is ending, the nature is there, but the nuance is that if you want to make him an independent learner, if you want that the child should be, looking at his or her own learning, being reflective of his or own learning, taking charge and ownership of his learning, then he needs ownership on assessment also. Like which way should he assess himself? So he creates a thing. So obviously there is a self-assessment involved in it. But the success criteria, let's say if you're making a product, it comes under design thinking. You're making a product, right? The product has specifications, right? It must meet those specifications. Similarly, any learning must meet certain tangible, measurable goals, assessments. When I say measurable, it does not mean quantifiable. Everything which is measurable is not necessarily quantifiable, but because learning is not like 2 kilos I've learned today, or 10 kilos, or 5 liters. It's not that quantifiable. So that's why what has happened is from norm assessments, which is about how did my friend perform, right? So if I got 97.5, that is better than somebody else who's got 97. That's norm assessment. We have moved to assessment criteria. So where there's a criteria given to you, okay, this is how a good essay should look like. These are the attributes of what I think is a good essay. And then you hit at that criteria, right? So n number of people could get an A star or a 7. All right. There's no first, second there. There's a standard there, a benchmark there. And what more if that benchmark is co-created with the child? Then he takes ownership of such assessment.
Exactly.
And then he reflects upon it.
Right. Yeah. I think taking ownership, and also then there's a more like a sense of belief attached to it also. You believe in it greater, you see the merit in it. And because of that, you're also willing to push yourself harder. Because back in the day, when you had like conventional modes of assessment, a lot of, a lot of students didn't know why they were studying a particular thing. They didn't know that what is the merit of, just, cramming up for an exam and then vomiting it out, on the day of the exam. So a lot of, I think, the concept of having continuous assessment, I think that has replaced a lot of the problems that were attached with the very traditional and conventional lens of looking at assessment.
And I remember some years back in national curriculum, they had continuous assessment, comprehensive
Correct.
continuous
Correct.
assessment, and the teaching faculty were alarmed. Oh my God, we have got 60 kids and I've got more tests to conduct and all that. But that's the point.
Yeah.
Good comprehensive continuous assessment does not mean that you're spending your time always testing. There are many ways. There are verbal feedbacks, oral feedbacks. There are various, all those form part of the ongoing assessment.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I really liked even one or two of the other examples that you gave. For example, creation of a portfolio, creation of a product, which is so different from how we see regular testing. I mean, because there are some students who don't probably possess the best of abilities to put everything that they know in an exam paper. Where every child is unique, every student is unique, but they might be simply wonderful at like coming up with a product, applying that theory to a practical thing, coming up with something which is also clearly reflective of how well the student has learned and absorbed the concept. So why not accept that as a mode of testing and assessment?
And why not peer assessment?
Absolutely.
So I mean, I'm sure all that can happen. Why not learning in cooperative groups? There's a lot of peer learning happening there also.
Correct.
Peer learning
Correct.
can lead to peer assessment. Other than self-assessment, there are different forms of assessment, not necessarily a pen and a paper test.
Exactly. I think that's the mold that we need to break out of. And obviously there are a bunch of schools that are already doing it in India, but I think we need to start encouraging and encouraging more number of schools to sort of think out of the box in terms of how they want to assess students.
And very interestingly, the word ongoing assessment is something our nursery to grade 5 people are doing now.
Wow.
So that's what we call in the PYP. Those are the terminologies we adopted in the PYP. And now it's percolating on top where we're thinking on those. So it has to be a dynamic process, right? And as I say, lifelong learner. So let's say if I'm teaching something for so many years and then I go back to teaching it, the courses are changing, keeping in changes of time. And most importantly, I think teachers do need, there's a lot of investment you need to do in the teaching faculty.
Correct.
By way of professional development. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you've really hit the nail on its head. I mean, this is something that has come out and which has been reflected upon widely in our conversation that we have had with educators. So obviously we want to revamp the system, but at the backbone of the system is the teachers. And it's really important that, if we want to make students to be lifelong learners, even teachers have to constantly reinvent and be lifelong learners, to constantly try new and new techniques, to improve the learning that we're delivering in schools today.
Sure. That's what I say. Sure. When the curriculum is 21st century and the student is 21st century, the teacher is 20th century.
Correct.
The poor teacher born in 2000 is now 21 years old. We'll still have to see her coming into our den, right? So obviously we are digital migrants. Students are digital natives. So it's essential that, this, aspect, this asset of technology, how it can help teachers to grow, needs to be, there. Right. I think Kritika will come back in a bit. We're just waiting. She's just dropped out. Yeah, she's back. Yeah.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I'm able to hear.
Fantastic. In fact, I must tell you, as soon as you made that comment on the teachers, I saw so many comments just being, typed into the chat box where everybody was agreeing with you because, obviously teachers are facing the pressure of this situation.
Yeah,
And I totally echo your sentiments there.
and that's investment in human capital.
Absolutely.
Education
Absolutely.
is that. I mean, uh, it's a need if you want to raise the level of raise the level of learning and the labor and the workforce in future and the citizen of future.
Correct.
Then you need to. I mean, I know today a lot of my kids talk in terms of sustainable things, right? Think of the market which is going to be in the 21st century, probably of all sustainable products, right?
Right.
So things are on the move. It's changing, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree with you there. And I think definitely, with the pandemic and with online learning, everything seems to be like going through a state of flux. I mean, obviously, we are all wanting to, we are itching back to get back to physical school. Some of the schools have opened up as well. But I think, I think a lot of people have also realized that, there's a bit of a hybrid model that is here to stay, because there is some merit. Obviously, teachers are irreplaceable by technology. But definitely, like you said, instead of seeing them as replacements, you can, see technology as enablers for better learning. So definitely some of the experimentation that we've had during this time is really going to change the landscape
Yeah.
and the way we look at, the Indian education system. Now, sir, before we end this conversation, I obviously have to ask you this question, that in your vast experience and diverse experience as an educator, what are the considerations that educators must keep in mind for measuring student learning? I think that'll be of immense help to our other fellow educators who have joined us today.
Okay. I think whether it's educators or policymakers or other people who are interested in learning, in improving the way we measure learning in today's school, need to look at three essential questions. One being, what really matters in a contemporary education, right? Second is, how do we assess those things that matter, right? And how might assessment enhance learning that matters and not just measure it? Okay. So I think these are the three critical questions which we need to have. And then for when you want to do these things, you know, at the macro level, you may want to do some backward planning, some curriculum mapping, have a process of curriculum review and development, and not just about content, about what you are assessing. So if you say content is there, you say skills are there, and you talk about higher order thinking skills, as well as conceptual learning, then you have to map that out, right? And do that. So I think when you say what are the considerations for measuring, I think these are the three questions. What are the three basic questions? When these three questions that can be used in an effort to ensure that all these components align, then we say, okay, what are the learning goals? What objectives do our students need to able to reach by the end of the course, right? And what kind of assessment will be there? How will I ensure that my student can demonstrate the learning goals that I have outlined? Demonstrate. I hope the word demonstrate means show, right?
Correct.
And then what strategies can I support to improve student understanding? In other words, what activities can the student perform to prepare them for evaluation? And so measuring, as I said, I uttered it earlier, that measurable does not always means quantifiable.
Correct. Correct.
So it does mean that you have to then take data. Data is very important. So assessment data, seeing assessment as a cycle, collecting that valid data, using that data. And perhaps the beginning is like how some of us do, is that we have some ways of assessing. Then we take a baseline year, we take the baseline data, and then we see how we can, benchmark that every year and out. What exactly do we want after 5 years or 2 years? Supposing I want reading to improve. So what kind of reading do I want to improve?
Correct. Correct.
And stuff like that. So it does require involvement of the entire school. It can't be top down. Maybe as a leader, I might give a vision, and I must be inspirational. I must be a person who who is situational leaders that hold hands of somebody who needs hold handing and let free the guy who can do things on his own. Why come in his way? You build that platform, you build that thing, and engage people in this conversation. All right?
Correct.
So because there's no, education is part of social sciences, right?
Right.
There are no human behavior is something where you say a lot of things with ifs and buts, right? A lot of assumptions you make that man is a rational human being, for example. Are we? At times we aren't. So,
Yeah.
You have to take all kinds of
Correct.
people. So, but I think your specific question, what are the consideration? I think school climate is a consideration. When you look at, you have to first create that climate, and then measurable, as I told you, is the three aspects, the three essential questions, which
absolutely. So I think, again, some very key takeaways from this is, and I think, for our fellow educators here, and coming from your experience as an experienced administrator, is definitely about creating the right climate, environment, and culture in your school. And I think another very important aspect that Sir highlighted was, the fact that we need to stop looking at it in a very traditional top-down approach way. Rather, it has to be collaborative. Everybody needs to sit on the table, give their 2 cents. And, only when you develop a system together will everybody believe in it, and there will be effective implementation of the same. Like today, we're talking about curriculum review. We're talking about, a review of the assessment patterns, assurance of learning, etc. All of that would only happen when the entire set of colleagues who are working on executing and implementing the system actually believe in it, so that, we take in everybody's suggestions, and it's not like, just, people working in silos, because that is going to hinder the implementation that we're going to have. I think so. This has been such a wonderful conversation that I've had with you. While we've been speaking, I was just running a couple of polls also to, get a sense of what our audience members are thinking. They totally agreed with you when, you said that, there is a need to revisit the learning that we're imparting in schools. We had 95% of our audience members who totally agreed with you and said, yes, we need to revisit the learning that we're imparting in schools. And clearly, right now, the last poll that I ran was, that did people thoroughly enjoy the session? And 100% of our audience members said that they completely enjoyed the session. And I can very confidently say this because, while I was, talking with you and discussing and conversing with you, you have given me so much of food for thought for me to reflect upon, ponder upon, the different ways and different perspectives that we can, look at learning and assessments. And I'm sure all of my audience members have also gained immensely from your insights that you have shared with us today. Thank you very much for taking out the time from your busy schedule and joining us in this conversation today, sir. It's truly very delightful.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share, because in sharing, we all grow.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you very much. And a very big thank you to all my audience members for joining me. We are going to be back again next week, where we're discussing another topic related to education next Thursday at 5 p.m. I hope to see many of you there. Thank you so much, sir, again. And we will connect soon. Thank you.